Welcome back, everybody. It's a delight to be here. My name is Chris Brown. I've been at Laracon for, I think, 7 years now, and it's a great opportunity to be back here sharing with you again. Even if we've never met, we've probably interacted online in some way. How many of you are using the Sthis Laravel permissions package in one of your applications? Wow, awesome. 30% of the room at least, hands up, that's great. How about using Laravel Valet? Yeah, we've probably interacted a little bit there too. That's awesome. My name, as I said, is Chris Brown. I've been a freelance developer for about 15 years, and I'm co-founder of the Zencard e-commerce application. I don't know if any of you have used that or heard of it. It's been a really exciting application to work with. We've got 100,000 live stores still using it right now, even after 15 years. This is really exciting. I'm, as I said, or mentioned, package maintainer for the Sthis Laravel permissions package. 3.25 million downloads as of this morning. That's pretty impressive. I'm an active contributor to the Laravel Valet package, and I'm also, as Sean alluded to, a public speaking coach. So now that I've set the bar really high for myself, I hope I can measure up to that. 5 years ago, I was working on an application and I had a problem. I ran into this situation where I needed to be able to allow contributors to edit their own content and allow super admins to do almost anything, regardless of other constraints in the application. And if you think of something like Reddit, I needed the ability to control only upvoting one level, not more than once on something, or downvoting only once, that sort of thing, but not allowing administrators to do more than that unnecessarily. And I also needed to be able to ensure that if a user had created a block one way or another in communication, that couldn't be overridden inappropriately by an administrator. And I found myself adding extra database fields, just flags in the database to control some of these pieces of information. And that didn't scale well. Something just didn't feel right about it, but well, this is before Laravel added the gate layer into Laravel. That was done in 5.1, which is about 4.5 years ago. And it took me about a year after that before I really dove in and started to study it and figure out how that even works. So my objectives of today's talk are to share with you those learnings and cover the basic ways that Laravel provides authorization capability, share with you some tips and tricks that I've learned to help save you some of the pain of those, and to discuss some related packages. I mentioned one of them, and help you have an understanding of maybe when to use or not use a package. So let's talk about Auth. First of all, Auth isn't Auth. Authorization is not authentication. When I was first looking at it, I got these two confused, or maybe not confused. They were intertwined so closely that I didn't really know the distinction. Authentication is controlling access to the application, and very often this is done by testing whether an actor is valid using a token, a password, that sort of thing. Then authorization is taking that authenticated user and determining what sort of access they're supposed to have, what abilities they're allowed to do within your application. In that context, there's a couple terms, nothing earth-shatteringly revealing here. Permissions are abilities or privileges. In Laravel, you will find that the parameters in many of its code, in the methods, actually use the word abilities. That's the variable name for the parameter. So I'm going to use these words interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. When we talk about roles, they can be more than just groups of responsibilities, but for simplicity today, we're going to assume that roles are really just groups of permissions. You can do super grouping and stuff into teams or whatever beyond that, but we're going to keep it simple here today. Laravel's authorization layer consists of a handful of things. First, there's the gate and the gate facade, which allows you to define rules or abilities and permissions, usually by passing a closure to it. And typically that closure is going to return a boolean response. Policies take that gate infrastructure and apply it to a specific eloquent model and actions, abilities, events related to that model. You can then use those and apply them at the middleware layer to control access through your routes and controllers. Then the validation layer allows you to apply these as well. You've probably seen the authorization method in the form request class if you've worked with those. And then, of course, it is also supported at the view layer with these blade directives, can, cannot, and can any. The guest directive technically is part of the authentication layer. However, the gate always interacts with you in terms of the authenticated user. So the gate is always returning false if you don't have an authenticated user. But that may not be what you want to check in certain cases. So the guest helper, blade directive, can be useful in that case. We will address that a little bit later with some examples. But enough theory. Let's look at some code. The gate layer allows you to use the define method to describe an ability. So you pass a string, in this case, edit settings, and then you pass the closure. You notice that the closure automatically receives the user as the first parameter. Laravel is going to inject that automatically. That's part of it, knowing who the authenticated user is, gives it to you already. So you can use that to test and again return a boolean response based on however your particular rule that you're describing or the ability you're describing needs to behave. If you want to pass an extra parameter, in this case we're passing not just the user but a post, Laravel will take those extra parameters that you ask for. I'll show an example in a moment of how that's done, but it will list those extra parameters after this. So you can do comparisons between objects. So how do we use those defined rules or abilities? We use the gate allows or denies methods. So you pass the string to the gate allows call, and then you can take action based on the positive response that comes from that. You could do the inverse and use the gate denies check. And then that's going to allow you to take action appropriately based on a falsy response from the gate. I mentioned that Laravel injects the current user. If you want to override that, you can pass the forUser method or use the forUser method and pass the specific user you want to be injected in, and it will do that instead of taking the current user. Your user model typically is going to be implementing the authorizable trait. The authorizable trait gives you these can and cannot helper methods, so you can use that to test for the abilities for the specific user. Again, you pass the string and the object that you wish it to be able to interact with. Let's move on to policies. Laravel's artisan command has a make policy command, and if you pass the model parameter here, then it will actually auto-generate all these methods for you. You don't have to use them all. In fact, you don't have to use any of them. If you don't pass the model, it won't create any, or it might create just the view one. And so you can implement however many of these methods suit for your application. Again, the goal is to return a Boolean response so it can take action accordingly. Here's an example of a view ability defined to the model policy, or in this case, the post policy. So we see that Laravel is auto-injecting the user, and it's auto-injecting the post for this particular post policy, and then you can take action according to the properties of the objects. You'll notice here that I've passed the user parameter or object as an optional parameter. This is how you can override Laravel's auto-expecting of it to be an authorized and authenticated user. If you didn't do that, it would automatically return false and everybody would be denied. So in the case of view, and everyone can view all visible posts, this makes sense because you want to allow a guest to be able to do that. You could also pass that user equals null instead of the question mark based on your PHP version. Let's talk about the controller briefly. If you are extending your controller from the base controller, you have the authorize method helper available. And that means you can pass the ability name and the model object, and it will call that policy and do the check. But the extra benefit of this authorize helper is if the policy returns false, it will automatically return an unauthorized exception. So you can catch that exception. You don't have to do any more code right here in your controller because the authorize method takes care of that for you. It'll reject it. So you can safely continue on with your code processing right after calling authorize, because unauthorized won't get through. The post object in this case, you're passing the model to the authorize helper. Many people just pass a single variable here, and that's perfectly fine. In most use cases, that's all you need. But what if you need to pass some additional context? I didn't know about this. I just learned this a few weeks ago and did a pull request to the docs to describe it. You can pass an array. If you pass an array, Laravel will automatically unpack that array, and all the elements of the array will be passed then to the gate in the same order. And so then in the gate, you can use it. In this case, I passed a category after passing the post. And of course, I can use that category as part of my filtering to determine viability in my response. Let's talk about middleware. Laravel comes with the can middleware. This allows you to pass the ability name to the can middleware description. And then if you're using route model binding, as in this code example, it will automatically resolve the post, in this case, and pass that through for you. At the view layer, we talked a moment ago about Blade offering directives for this. So you simply pass the string for the ability name, and then you can pass the model object that you wish it to interact with and stick your approved content in between there. You might put a form in the case of updating a post or editing. You might, or I very often find myself using the can wrapper around just buttons that are supposed to show or not show based on whatever's going on in my application. You can use the can, cannot, can any, and then of course the else and derivatives of those. Can any, it will respond as soon as it finds one that passes truthfully, it will carry on. You have to pass it an array for it to do that. What about the situation where you've got a policy method described of a certain name, but you also have the same name, that same ability described at the gate? What happens? So in the case here, the user can update the post. Laravel first looks to the post model for a policy method named update for that update ability. If it finds it there, it will use it and respond. If it doesn't find it, it's going to jump down to the gate layer and say, is there an ability defined for this same string, whether or not a model object is expected for it, and it will pass it through. So if you're trying to troubleshoot your application, you're getting some slightly unexpected responses, you might want to research what abilities you've defined through all the different ways you could possibly do that, and check whether you've missed defining one in your policy, and then so the gate is just firing on it, or maybe you've defined something at the policy level that you didn't know, and so the gate's not firing for some reason. Some troubleshooting tips that I've benefited from because I've made some mistakes with that. I also often hear questions, so how do I handle a super administrator? Somebody who's supposed to have godlike privileges in the application. Laravel has thought of that as well. There's a before helper on the gate that you can use to define a Boolean response, and this will fire before all the other abilities are checked at the gate layer. It's important to realize Laravel will inject the user for you, but you should not return a false unless you want everyone to always get a falsy response, and then nobody can do anything in the application. So return true if it's supposed to be allowed, but return null if you just want it to cascade through to the rest of the gate checks. The before helper also exists at the policy level with a slight twist. Same functionality, you test based on it, and it fires before and allows the super admin to do things. However, In this example, just below the before method that's here, there's an update method. That update method or ability must exist for the before to even fire. If the update doesn't exist, the before will be ignored. So if you're testing whether something's working and you're not knowing why your super admin isn't getting the privileges through a policy, check to make sure you actually have the method defined before you try and have it rely on the before. So super admins, we have the policy before, the gate before. There's also a gate after that can be leveraged depending what your needs are. This is a way you can kind of override other things that have happened to maybe enforce other integrity constraints. I talked about not over upvoting or over downvoting things or bypassing other rules. You can put code in there for that. Flake has posted a thing on his Spatsy blog about how to discuss and determine whether the after helper would be useful for you. I mentioned the impersonation bit here because it's a bit of it's really not an authorization issue. However, it is something that you may want to do. Take control of your application as a certain user so you can see it from their perspective, see what they can do, what access they have, and how it works for them. I will talk about a package that allows that to work later on. I always get questions about how do I now take and do all this with the database? There's a lot of code to talk about how to integrate something in the database, but I've compressed it to just 2 slides. So we're going to make a lot of assumptions here. Assuming we have a standard Laravel or eloquent permissions model, and it has a one-to-many or has many and belongs to many relationship with the user model, we can define this permissions method, which is the belongs to many relationship on the user. And then we can define a method that would be has permission to, and have it do the check. Have it look up from the eloquent model, what is the name of the ability I'm checking for, and respond. If it finds it and it suits for this user, I can respond accordingly. The logic that you would implement might be different than this, but this is a really, really simple example of how to do that. So now, how do we actually register this permission to fire? You want to retrieve those permission objects from the database, probably want to cache them. You're going to run into n+1 issues depending how you do it, so be careful what you do with it. But then you map over those permissions and simply assign the closure. You don't actually do the check necessarily, although in some applications you might want to do a real-time check for all those permissions. Doing it this way with the callback can make a lot of extra database calls, but if your application makes sense to do it that way, then do it that way. So that's the real simple way of just putting that in the database and defining those things in a way that allows you to give control to one user to specify what another user can do. Or you can adjust which roles or permissions exist in your whole application by some of those users. In form requests, we can also leverage the gate and policy capabilities. You simply, in the authorize method of your form request, call the can helper. Call the gate in some way and have it give a response. And that way, before inputs are processed in your controller through the form request, it will put a block up if the person isn't even allowed to do this. There are some advanced things you can do by pre-processing, preparing your data for validation in conjunction with the authorization as well. I'm not going to go into greater detail. This afternoon, there's a talk that will talk about some of those things. Front-end clients. Full disclosure, I am primarily a back-end developer, but I always get questions about front-end implications. So the one thing I hear most, and the response I hear most, is can I expose the permissions of my application to the front end? Well, it depends. Often, yes, just don't trust it, because the user can tamper with that information. So always, always, always rely on the back end to verify or validate that those permissions are truly granted to that particular user, especially when working with sensitive information. It's just good practice to always check the back end when you're dealing with permissions. Best practices. Another thing that I have learned is to not test for roles generally in my application. I mentioned a moment ago that I often use the can wrapper around buttons and different access I want to give in a user interface. I started doing this with roles, but then I discovered I have to refactor, I have to rip it all apart because I need to add extra things in there that don't really fit in that role, but they fit generally in that space. So I refactored everything, and I just simply used the can helper to test individual abilities all over my application. So if you do that more often than not, you will save yourself a bunch of pain. I also hear people asking, what should I call my ability names? They're just a string. What should I call them? If you embrace the CRUD by design principle that Adam Wathan has popularized, or just simply embrace RESTful controller method names, you have the ability to kind of think in the concepts of the terminology that might best describe your ability names. You can do whatever you want, but that's one thing I have found helpful, and I've seen people go, that makes better sense. Hopefully that can help you. What about packages? When should I use a package? You want to first make sure that you figured out what permission needs your application actually has. Build that capability into your code. Put it in the code first. Don't start first with the database in mind, because most of your controls can be handled in code with what Laravel offers. Next, think, do you need the ability for one user to control what another user can do, or what permissions or roles are available in your application, even removing some completely? Then also think about how many layers of control do I need? Now, this may not determine how your package works, but it might help you choose which package features to look for. Most important thing in selecting packages is less is more. There's a lot of cognitive load. When you embrace a package, it's got its whole API that you have to learn. And if there's so many things in there that you don't even use, then you might be bringing extra technical overload that you don't need. The 4 most popular access control packages that I've seen are, I'm a little biased towards this one. It handles things in a way very similar to the database example I gave a moment ago, although there's some more layers to create some efficiencies around it. It's very popular. Laratrust is also an excellent package, and one of its things that I appreciate about it is it allows you to add the ability to grant roles and permissions to teams, so kind of groups of groups. And Trust is another one, and it's one of the things I've enjoyed about its code is it allows a lot of wildcard pattern matching before beginning and end of pattern matching when you're testing roles or abilities. And then Joseph Silber has done a great job with the Bouncer package, and it takes a lot of the same principles and features of the Spatsy package. However, it does things in a slightly different, opinionated way. And it's also framework agnostic. It still works specifically with Eloquent, but it doesn't care which framework. I mean, we know that framework choice is limited, but it is that. Then I mentioned the Laravel impersonation capability. This package by Lab 404 is the one I've really appreciated using because of its thoroughness and ease of use to be able to take control of your application as another user. Check it out. It's just an extra thing I decided to throw in here for you. Laravel's documentation is very thorough on this subject. I added a few things the other day, and when I was going through it, I realized, why am I giving this talk? All this information is there. So it's really easy for you to find this information. I even changed some of my examples that I was using to match more closely to the documentation, just to create that similarity for quick comprehension. So do check out the documentation. I've talked about Laravel's gate and policy infrastructure and how those rules can be defined and leveraged in your application. Talked about how that intersects with middleware and with validation and at the view layer. Talked a little bit about the fallback process. Remember, policy methods and abilities fire first, and then it cascades down to the gate layer. Talked about front-end security, make sure the back-end is always the final arbiter of whether permission should be granted. In best practices, I talked about trying to leverage the ability testing, using the can helpers more than testing with other custom functions around roles. Talked about super admins and how to give extra control around other places in your application. And we talked about packages and how you might want to choose or select or pick some examples or find ideas of things that you might not have seen before. And of course, Laravel's documentation is very thorough. I hope that I've given you some information that will help you fast-track your implementation of Laravel's authorization layer and minimize some pitfalls that you might encounter and enjoy it very effectively. You can find me on Twitter or GitHub and certainly all around the conference floor here. Come up to me. I'd love to chat about authorization and even about the SPATSI package and things that you might be encountering with that. And with that, gate closed. Thank you very much.